There are moments in life that weigh us down in ways words can't capture. The feeling of loss, the hollow emptiness that lingers long after someone you love is gone. Grief isn't just an emotion, it's an invisible weight, a presence that quietly fills every corner of your being. It doesn't announce itself, it just quietly settles in, like a shadow that refuses to leave. Maybe you felt it, the ache that comes when you realize a chapter has closed. Or perhaps the pain that hits in waves, each one more overwhelming than the last. But what if, in the midst of this pain, there's a way to find peace? A way to not just cope, but to transform the sorrow into something that brings clarity, understanding, even healing. In Buddhist philosophy, grief is not something we fight against or try to push away. It's not a negative emotion that we need to get over. Instead, it's an opportunity for deep reflection, self-awareness, and spiritual growth. You see, grief doesn't have to be the end of something. In the teachings of the Buddha, there's a profound wisdom that suggests that grief, when understood through the lens of impermanence, attachment, and mindfulness, can be the doorway to liberation. But how? How can something as painful, as heart-wrenching as grief be transformed into a path of healing? Let me take you on a journey, a story of someone who lost everything. Someone who, like many of us, couldn't understand how to navigate the overwhelming force of sorrow. Her name was Kisa Gautami. Kisa Gautami was a mother, a woman who loved with all her heart. She lived a simple life, filled with moments of joy and contentment until the day her child fell ill and died. In her grief, Kisa could not accept this loss. She could not fathom how life could be so cruel. The pain was too much to bear. She ran from house to house, searching for a remedy, a way to bring her child back. It was then that she was sent to the Buddha. The Buddha, seeing her suffering, did not offer an easy solution. Instead, he gave her a task, one that would change her forever. He asked her to go and find a mustard seed from a family that had never known death. Kisa Gautami searched for days, knocking on doors, only to hear the same answer. Every family had known death. The rich, the poor, the old, the young, all had experienced loss. With each visit, Kisa's heart grew heavier, and yet a profound truth began to settle in her mind. She returned to the Buddha, not with a mustard seed, but with an understanding. Death, loss, and grief are part of the fabric of life. We are all touched by impermanence. And in that moment of realization, Kisa found peace. Grief. It touches everyone. We all face it at different times in our lives. And yet, how often do we resist it? How often do we try to escape it, numb it, or hide it away in the dark corners of our hearts? The Buddha teaches that grief, like all forms of suffering, comes from our attachment to what is temporary, what is impermanent. We cling to the people we love, the experiences that bring us joy, the very essence of who we are. And when those things change, when they fade or leave us, we are left broken, shattered by the force of impermanence. But what if, instead of resisting grief, we could use it as a tool? What if we could see it for what it truly is, not a punishment, but a reminder of the beauty of life's fleeting nature? What if we could take that weight of sorrow and transform it into wisdom? The teachings of Buddhism invite us to look deeper, to acknowledge our grief, to feel it fully, but also to understand it. To not shy away from the pain, but to sit with it, reflect on it, and ultimately to let it guide us toward healing. This is where the path begins. Understanding that grief, in all its rawness and beauty, is a natural part of life. It's a part of the cycle of existence that the Buddha himself encountered throughout his life. And yet, through his own suffering and losses, he found a way to transcend it. The question we're left with then is this: can Buddhism help us overcome grief? Can it help us transform the pain, the sadness, the weight that grief brings? In the chapters that follow, we'll explore this question. We'll dive into the teachings of the Buddha, learn how to understand the nature of grief through the lens of impermanence, and uncover practices that can help us move from sorrow to serenity. Join me as we begin this journey, a journey not just through grief, but toward freedom. The freedom that comes when we stop fighting against the pain and instead allow it to teach us. There are moments in life that weigh us down in ways words can't capture. The feeling of loss, the hollow emptiness that lingers long after someone you love is gone. Grief isn't just an emotion, it's an invisible weight, a presence that quietly fills every corner of your being. It doesn't announce itself, it just quietly settles in, like a shadow that refuses to leave. Maybe you felt it, the ache that comes when you realize a chapter has closed. Or perhaps the pain that hits in waves, each one more overwhelming than the last. But what if, in the midst of this pain, there's a way to find peace? A way to not just cope, but to transform the sorrow into something that brings clarity, understanding, even healing. In Buddhist philosophy, grief is not something we fight against or try to push away. It's not a negative emotion that we need to get over. Instead, it's an opportunity for deep reflection, self-awareness, and spiritual growth. You see, grief doesn't have to be the end of something. In the teachings of the Buddha, there's a profound wisdom that suggests that grief, when understood through the lens of impermanence, attachment, and mindfulness, can be the doorway to liberation. But how? How can something as painful, as heart-wrenching as grief be transformed into a path of healing? Let me take you on a journey, a story of someone who lost everything. Someone who, like many of us, couldn't understand how to navigate the overwhelming force of sorrow. Her name was Kisa Gautami. Kisa Gautami was a mother, a woman who loved with all her heart. She lived a simple life, filled with moments of joy and contentment until the day her child fell ill and died. In her grief, Kisa could not accept this loss. She could not fathom how life could be so cruel. The pain was too much to bear. She ran from house to house, searching for a remedy, a way to bring her child back. It was then that she was sent to the Buddha. The Buddha, seeing her suffering, did not offer an easy solution. Instead, he gave her a task, one that would change her forever. He asked her to go and find a mustard seed from a family that had never known death. Kisa Gautami searched for days, knocking on doors, only to hear the same answer. Every family had known death. The rich, the poor, the old, the young, all had experienced loss. With each visit, Kisa's heart grew heavier, and yet a profound truth began to settle in her mind. She returned to the Buddha, not with a mustard seed, but with an understanding. Death, loss, and grief are part of the fabric of life. We are all touched by impermanence. And in that moment of realization, Kisa found peace. Grief. It touches everyone. We all face it at different times in our lives. And yet, how often do we resist it? How often do we try to escape it, numb it, or hide it away in the dark corners of our hearts? The Buddha teaches that grief, like all forms of suffering, comes from our attachment to what is temporary, what is impermanent. We cling to the people we love, the experiences that bring us joy, the very essence of who we are. And when those things change, when they fade or leave us, we are left broken, shattered by the force of impermanence. But what if, instead of resisting grief, we could use it as a tool? What if we could see it for what it truly is? Not a punishment, but a reminder of the beauty of life's fleeting nature. What if we could take that weight of sorrow and transform it into wisdom? The teachings of Buddhism invite us to look deeper, to acknowledge our grief, to feel it fully, but also to understand it. To not shy away from the pain, but to sit with it, reflect on it, and ultimately to let it guide us toward healing. This is where the path begins. Understanding that grief, in all its rawness and beauty, is a natural part of life. It's a part of the cycle of existence that the Buddha himself encountered throughout his life. And yet, through his own suffering and losses, he found a way to transcend it. The question we're left with then is this: can Buddhism help us overcome grief? Can it help us transform the pain, the sadness, the weight that grief brings? In the chapters that follow, we'll explore this question. We'll dive into the teachings of the Buddha, learn how to understand the nature of grief through the lens of impermanence, and uncover practices that can help us move from sorrow to serenity. Join me as we begin this journey, a journey not just through grief, but toward freedom. The freedom that comes when we stop fighting against the pain and instead allow it to teach us. There is a saying in Buddhism, "This too shall pass." It's a reminder that everything in life, both the moments of joy and the moments of sorrow, are fleeting. But how often do we truly internalize this truth? When grief comes, it feels like an immovable weight, something that will last forever. But in reality, grief, like all emotions, is as fluid as the river that constantly flows, never stagnant. When we think of impermanence, we often imagine loss. We think of loved ones passing away or dreams that have been shattered. We think of endings, but impermanence is not just about endings. It's about the constant movement of life, the ebb and flow of experiences, of emotions, of everything we hold dear. The Buddha, in his deep insight, saw life as a river that is always moving, always changing. Nothing stays the same, not even our suffering. Grief comes to us like a wave, powerful and overwhelming, but even the mightiest wave eventually recedes. It's only when we try to hold on to the wave, when we resist the flow of life, that we get caught in the undertow. Grief, like all things, is impermanent. It rises, it intensifies, and then it falls. The more we resist this natural flow, the more we trap ourselves in a cycle of suffering. But when we understand that grief is as impermanent as the seasons, we allow ourselves to feel it fully, without fear, without judgment. And in this acceptance, there is peace. Impermanence is not just a concept, it's a lived experience. Every breath we take, every moment that passes, is a reminder that nothing lasts forever. The Buddha taught that suffering arises when we try to hold on to the fleeting moments, when we become attached to people, places, and things that we cannot control. But in accepting impermanence, we release our attachment. We learn to flow with life, rather than fighting against it. Grief, like all emotions, is a part of this natural flow. It's not something to fear or avoid. It's simply a wave that we must ride, allowing it to wash over us and then pass. The more we resist, the longer the wave lasts. But when we embrace the moment, when we allow ourselves to feel, to experience, and to release, the wave eventually fades. And in its place, a sense of calm arises. Think of the nature around you, trees shedding their leaves in autumn, flowers blooming and then fading, the tides that come and go. All of these are symbols of impermanence. They are expressions of the cycle of life. And so too is our grief. It is a part of the natural order, a temporary phase in the ever-changing flow of existence. When we allow ourselves to embrace this natural cycle, we stop seeing grief as something to fight against. We see it as part of the flow, just like the seasons change. There is a beauty in knowing that grief, like everything else, has its time. It is born, it grows, and it eventually fades away, making room for new experiences, new emotions, new phases of life. The challenge comes when we cling to grief, when we hold on to the pain as if it defines us. We may tell ourselves that we cannot live without the person we've lost, or that our world has ended with the loss of a dream. But in doing so, we trap ourselves in a cycle of suffering. The Buddha's teachings remind us to release our attachment to the past, to let go of the idea that grief should last forever. In doing so, we not only free ourselves from the pain of loss, but we also open ourselves to the possibility of healing. Healing does not mean forgetting. It does not mean pretending that the grief didn't happen. It means embracing the impermanence of grief, knowing that just as the pain came, it will eventually fade. We can begin to see grief as part of the great cycle of life. Each wave of sorrow that passes is an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to become more in tune with the flow of life. We can find peace in the knowledge that grief, like all things, is temporary. And in that temporary nature, there is freedom. This is the beauty of impermanence. It teaches us to let go, not just of our attachments to people or things, but of our attachment to the way we think things should be. It allows us to accept that life is ever-changing, and with that change comes both joy and sorrow. Neither lasts forever. Both are part of the dance of life. As we begin to embrace the impermanence of grief, we start to understand that life is not about avoiding pain. It's about learning to move with it, to ride the waves, knowing that eventually they will pass. The more we let go, the more we become attuned to the natural flow of life, without fear, without resistance. Grief, at its heart, is born from attachment. It's a word we've all heard before, but do we truly understand its weight? We live in a world where attachment is woven into the fabric of our lives. Attachments to people, places, desires, even to our own identities. We seek security in the things we hold close, in the things that give us a sense of purpose and meaning. But attachment, as the Buddha so wisely taught, is the root of all suffering. When we love, we attach. We form bonds that give us comfort, joy, and a sense of belonging. But the moment we lose what we are attached to, we are left with a void, an emptiness that feels unbearable. This void is grief, and it arises because we cling to something that was never meant to be permanent. The Buddha's teachings on attachment are clear. Attachment to the impermanent is what causes suffering. We become attached to people, to experiences, to the way things should be. And when change inevitably comes, when we lose what we love, we experience the pain of grief. But why do we attach in the first place? Why do we cling so tightly to that which is destined to fade? The answer lies in the way we perceive the world. We see things as fixed, as permanent, even when we know that everything around us is constantly changing. We build our identities around these attachments, our relationships, our successes, our material possessions. And in doing so, we trap ourselves in the belief that these things define us, that our happiness is tied to them. But this belief is a trap. It's an illusion. Attachment doesn't bring lasting happiness. It only brings suffering when those things change or are taken away. Think of the people you love, the things you cherish. Have you ever felt a sense of fear that they might be taken from you? Have you ever found yourself clinging to the moments you have with them, desperate to make them last? This is the nature of attachment. We fear loss, we fear change because we mistake these attachments for our sense of self. We think that without them, we would not be complete. This is the core of suffering. We are attached to the idea that things should remain as they are. We are attached to the illusion of permanence. But just as the Buddha taught, this attachment is the root of all suffering. We are not meant to hold on to the world as if it were ours to control. We are meant to flow with it, to accept the natural rhythm of life. And in that acceptance, we find peace. When we lose something or someone dear to us, grief arises. But the grief itself is not the problem. It's the attachment, the belief that we should never have lost what we loved. That makes the grief feel unbearable. It is the clinging, the unwillingness to let go, that creates suffering. The more we attach, the more we suffer when the inevitable changes come. But what if we could release that attachment? What if we could embrace the flow of life, knowing that all things, good or bad, joyous or painful, are temporary? What if we could learn to love without clinging, to care without holding on? This is the essence of the Buddha's teachings on attachment. It's not that we should stop loving, stop caring, or stop forming connections. It's that we should do so with the understanding that everything we love is impermanent. By acknowledging this truth, we free ourselves from the suffering that comes with attachment. We stop fearing loss and start embracing the present moment as it is. Imagine a tree in the autumn, its leaves slowly falling to the ground. The tree does not resist the fall of its leaves. It does not mourn their loss. It simply lets them go, knowing that this is the cycle of life. In the same way, we too must learn to let go, to release our attachment to the things we love, understanding that their impermanence is what makes them precious. Grief is not something to be avoided or feared. It's a natural part of life, a result of our attachment. But by understanding the root of our grief, our attachment to the impermanent, we can begin to free ourselves from the suffering it brings. We can love deeply without holding on too tightly. We can cherish the moments we have without fearing that they will end. In letting go of our attachment to permanence, we free ourselves to experience life in its fullest, most vibrant form. We stop living in fear of loss, and instead, we live fully in the present, appreciating what we have while we have it. Grief, then, becomes not something to be avoided, but something to be understood, to be embraced. And in that understanding, we find the peace that comes from living in harmony with the ever-changing flow of life. In the midst of grief, we often find ourselves lost in the storm of emotions. The weight of sorrow feels like an endless current, pulling us under, leaving us gasping for air. We search for something to hold on to, a lifeline that can bring us back to the surface, to peace. And yet, in our search, we may overlook the simple tools that are right in front of us, tools that have been used for thousands of years to heal the heart and mind. One of these tools is mindfulness. Mindfulness is not just a practice, it's a way of being. It's the art of being fully present in the moment, of paying attention to each breath, each sensation without judgment. In the midst of grief, mindfulness becomes a refuge, a space where we can sit with our emotions without being overwhelmed by them. It allows us to observe our pain, not as something that defines us, but as something that we can feel, understand, and ultimately let go. Grief often pulls us into the past, into memories of what was lost. We replay moments of joy, of love, wishing we could go back. Or we project into the future, imagining a life without the person we love, wondering how we will ever move forward. But mindfulness teaches us to be here now with whatever we're feeling. It teaches us that the only moment we truly have is this one. When we practice mindfulness, we stop fighting against our grief. We stop trying to push it away or deny it. Instead, we sit with it. We breathe with it. We allow it to be part of our experience without becoming consumed by it. The pain may still be there, but we no longer let it control us. Mindfulness brings us back to the present moment, where grief, though still a part of us, does not have to dominate our experience. It teaches us to breathe through the pain, to sit with it, and to acknowledge that grief, like all things, will change. But mindfulness is only one part of the healing process. The other essential tool is meditation. Meditation is the practice of quieting the mind, of turning inward to connect with our deepest self. When we meditate, we create space, space between our thoughts, space between our emotions, space to just be. In this space, we can begin to heal. We can begin to release the attachment to our grief, to the stories we tell ourselves about loss. Through meditation, we can start to let go of the need to control our emotions and simply allow them to flow. There are many types of meditation, but when it comes to grief, the practice of loving-kindness meditation, or metta, is particularly powerful. This form of meditation involves sending love and compassion to ourselves and others, especially those who are suffering. In the process, we begin to soften the grip that grief has on our hearts. In metta meditation, we first focus on ourselves. We offer ourselves the same love and compassion that we would offer a dear friend in pain. May I be at peace, we say silently. May I be free from suffering. These words, though simple, hold immense power. They remind us that we, too, are worthy of love, worthy of healing. They remind us that it's okay to grieve, but it's also okay to find peace in the midst of that grief. As we continue, we extend these wishes to others. We send love to the people we've lost, wishing them peace. We send love to those who are suffering, knowing that their grief, too, is a part of the natural cycle of life. By extending compassion, we not only heal ourselves, but we also honor the grief of others, acknowledging the shared human experience of loss. Meditation and mindfulness are not quick fixes. They are practices that require patience and consistency. But when we make them a part of our daily routine, they offer a way to sit with grief without being overwhelmed. They give us the tools to process our emotions with compassion, to heal without rushing, and to allow ourselves the time and space to grieve. As we sit in meditation, we begin to notice that the grief, while still present, no longer feels as heavy. We realize that we don't have to carry it alone. With each breath, we learn to release the tension in our bodies. With each exhale, we let go of a little more of the pain. And with each inhale, we invite peace, healing, and love into our hearts. In the stillness of meditation, we begin to see that grief is not something that can be fixed. It is not something that can be erased. It is something that must be felt, experienced, and allowed to pass. Meditation teaches us that healing is not about pushing grief away or pretending it doesn't exist. Healing is about being with grief, understanding it, and learning to coexist with it in a peaceful way. The more we practice mindfulness and meditation, the more we learn to embrace the impermanence of grief. We stop seeing it as a burden and start seeing it as a part of the flow of life. We begin to understand that just as the pain came, it will eventually fade. And in the meantime, we have the tools to hold it gently, to allow it to be, without letting it consume us. Grief, like all emotions, is an expression of life. And by practicing mindfulness and meditation, we can transform it from something that overwhelms us into something that teaches us. It is not the end of the road, but a part of the journey. A journey that, with patience and love, can lead us back to peace. Grief is a heavy burden to bear. It has a way of enveloping us in a fog, clouding our vision, and isolating us in our sorrow. We often feel alone in our pain, as though the weight of our loss is too much for one heart to carry. But in those moments of darkness, there is a light that can guide us, a light that comes not from within, but from the love and compassion we extend to ourselves and to others. Compassion, in the Buddhist tradition, is the wish for others to be free from suffering. It's the deep understanding that all beings, including ourselves, are bound by the universal experience of pain. And just as we would extend compassion to a dear friend in their time of sorrow, we must also offer that same compassion to ourselves when grief strikes. It can be easy to forget our own worth when we are grieving. We may feel as if our pain makes us weak, as if we are somehow broken. But in the teachings of the Buddha, compassion is not reserved for the strong or the happy. It is for everyone, especially those who are suffering. And this includes you. In the practice of compassion, we begin by turning inward. We offer ourselves the same kindness, care, and love that we would offer a friend in need. When grief arises, it's important to pause and recognize that it's okay to feel this pain. It's okay to be vulnerable, to feel the weight of the world on our shoulders. In those moments, we need not berate ourselves for our sorrow. Instead, we must offer ourselves the comfort of compassion, acknowledging that grief is a natural part of life, and that it doesn't diminish our value as human beings. Compassion is not just about feeling sorry for ourselves. It's about feeling with ourselves. It's about opening our hearts to our own suffering and embracing it with love. Just as the Buddha taught that all beings are interconnected, we too are interconnected with our own experiences. Grief, though painful, is a shared human experience. When we embrace this truth, we begin to transform the way we relate to our pain. But compassion is not only for ourselves. It extends beyond, reaching out to others who are suffering, offering them the same love and understanding that we offer ourselves. In fact, one of the most healing aspects of compassion is its ability to transform suffering through connection. When we share in the suffering of others, when we hold space for their grief, we find that our own pain becomes more bearable. It's as if the act of loving someone else, of offering compassion without expectation, creates a ripple effect that softens our own sorrow. This is the power of compassion. It has the ability to transform suffering, to turn the weight of grief into a shared experience, one that binds us together rather than isolating us. Think of a time when you've offered a kind word or a gesture of support to someone in pain. Notice how it made you feel. How, in that moment, you were not just a bystander to their suffering, but an active participant in their healing. In those moments, compassion becomes a healing force. It is no longer just an idea, but a living, breathing energy that flows between hearts. When we are grieving, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by our emotions, to feel like we are drowning in sorrow. But compassion teaches us that grief is not something we must face alone. We are not meant to carry our pain in isolation. It is through the act of loving, of caring for ourselves and others, that we begin to heal. Compassion offers us a bridge from suffering to peace. In the Buddhist tradition, there is a powerful practice known as metta or loving-kindness meditation. In this practice, we focus on sending love and well wishes to ourselves, to others, and to the world. It begins with wishing ourselves peace, freedom from suffering, and happiness. Then we extend those same wishes to others, first to loved ones, then to strangers, and eventually to all beings. As we practice loving kindness, we begin to notice a shift. Our grief, which once felt sharp and unbearable, begins to soften. The pain is still there, but we no longer cling to it as tightly. By offering ourselves compassion, we are giving ourselves permission to grieve without shame, without guilt. And by extending that same compassion to others, we become part of the healing process, not just for ourselves, but for the world. Compassion, in essence, is the antidote to suffering. It is the balm that soothes the wounds of the heart. And when we practice compassion, we begin to transform our grief from something that feels like a burden into something that becomes a part of our shared human experience. We realize that we are not alone in our suffering, and that love, whether directed inward or outward, has the power to heal. As you sit with your grief, try offering yourself a moment of compassion. Say to yourself, "May I be at peace. May I be free from suffering. May I live with love in my heart." Allow these words to wash over you, to soften the edges of your pain. Know that in this moment, you are not alone. You are part of a vast web of beings who, just like you, are experiencing the fullness of life, the joys, the sorrows, the losses, and the love. Through compassion, we learn to transform our suffering. And in that transformation, we find healing, not just for ourselves, but for the world. Grief is a journey that can feel as long as it is profound. At the start, it seems like an insurmountable mountain, its peak hidden in the clouds of sorrow, leaving us wondering if we'll ever find our way to the other side. But as we walk this path, we begin to realize something remarkable. Grief is not just something to be survived. It is something that can transform us, something that can lead us, if we allow it, to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us. In Buddhism, the path to liberation is not a linear journey. It is not about escaping the pain, but learning to walk with it, understanding it, and ultimately transcending it. Grief in its rawest form is a kind of suffering, one that touches the very core of our being. But like all suffering, it is impermanent. It is a part of life, not the end of it. When we learn to sit with our grief, to embrace it with mindfulness, compassion, and acceptance, we begin to unravel the layers of attachment and desire that fuel our suffering. Grief arises from our attachments, our clinging to what was, to what we've lost. It is the natural response to the impermanence of life. But through the teachings of the Buddha, we come to understand that clinging is what creates our suffering. It is our resistance to the natural flow of life that traps us in pain. Liberation, then, is not found in the absence of grief, but in the freedom to experience it fully, without being controlled by it. As we allow ourselves to feel the depth of our sorrow, we also begin to see the impermanence of that sorrow. We begin to understand that just as the waves of grief come crashing in, they will eventually recede. And in the space between those waves, we find peace. This is the paradox of grief. It is both a burden and a blessing. It teaches us about the fleeting nature of life, about the fragility of existence. It opens our hearts, not just to pain, but to the possibility of transformation. It teaches us to let go, not just of our attachments to people and things, but of our attachments to the very idea of permanence. Through this letting go, we come closer to liberation. Grief, when experienced with mindfulness and compassion, becomes a mirror. It reflects back to us the deepest truths about ourselves, the truth of our interconnectedness with all beings, the truth of our impermanence, and the truth of our capacity to heal. As we navigate the sorrow, we learn to see the beauty in the brokenness. We learn to honor what was, without being defined by what is no longer. And so, Grief, in its truest sense, is not the end of the road. It is the beginning of a new journey, a journey of self-discovery, of awakening, and of liberation. As we walk through the valley of sorrow, we come to understand that we are not simply the sum of our losses. We are the sum of our capacity to love, to heal, and to rise again, even in the face of pain. Through mindfulness, we learn to be present with our grief, to witness it without being consumed by it. Through compassion, we learn to open our hearts to ourselves and others, to recognize that we are not alone in our suffering. And through meditation, we cultivate the space to allow grief to flow through us, not as a force that defines us, but as a passing storm that in time will clear. As you reflect on your own journey with grief, remember that it is not a path to be rushed. Healing, like all things, takes time, but every step you take, every breath you draw, brings you closer to a deeper understanding, to a place of peace, and to a space where liberation from suffering is not just a distant dream, but a living reality. Grief, in its rawness, is an invitation. It invites you to release the old, to let go of attachments, and to awaken to the truth of your own impermanence. And in this awakening, you find freedom, not in the absence of sorrow, but in the acceptance of it as part of the great dance of life. So, as we conclude this journey together, remember that grief, though it may feel like a weight that drags you down, is also a path, one that, if walked with awareness and love, leads to liberation. Embrace it, not as something to escape, but as a teacher that reveals the deepest wisdom about life, love, and the impermanence of all things. And as you move forward, know this: you are not defined by your grief. You are defined by your capacity to heal, to love, and to rise again and again like the sun after the storm.